Okay, shall we get started? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Billness lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Kumail Rajani. Before we start, just a quick reminder that after the talk, there will be some time for Q&A. So you're more than welcome to ask your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom. You type your question in, and I will read your question to our speaker. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kumail Rajani, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in Islamic Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies of the University of Exeter, where he also carried out his doctoral studies. Also very pleased to say that Kumail is the recipient of the one-year postdoctoral writing fellowship awarded from Billness in 2022. And he was recently awarded a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship for the upcoming 3 years, 2023 and 2025. His research is primarily focused on the origins and development of hadith corpora, but Kumail is also interested in aspects of Islamic law and legal theory. He recently edited a volume on the sound traditions, studies in Ismaʿili texts and thought, which was published by Brill in 2021. And he is also currently working on converting his PhD thesis on making sense of Ismaʿili traditions into a monograph. His talk tonight is titled In Search of the Sources of the Sources, Exploring Fatimid Libraries of North Africa. So without further ado, Kumail, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nikolai, for this kind and very generous introduction. I would like to begin by thanking British Institute for Libyan and North African Studies for providing this opportunity to discuss some of my thoughts and ideas about the topic which I'm going to present tonight. I would like to thank Pauline and Nicolo, who have worked tirelessly, not only for this session, but for other sessions as well, and particularly for this lecture. I can imagine and understand how much time it requires for coordination and arranging and pre-arrangement of the lecture, so on and so forth. So I'm really grateful for both of you for your incredible support throughout this last month or so when we were in conversation about this lecture. This particular postdoctoral writing fellowship from Billness has provided me the opportunity to focus on converting my PhD thesis into a monograph, which I'm currently in the process. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity as well. Tonight, I'm going to discuss about the sources of the sources, examining the libraries, Fatimid libraries of North Africa. Just to give a brief introduction about what tonight's lecture is going to be about. What I will be presenting is some of the aspects of my PhD thesis, which is going to be converted in a monograph, as I just mentioned. As you would appreciate, any PhD project is complex, whereas publishers would be interested in simplifying some of the aspects and leaving the technical issues from the final publication. So my job throughout these last few months has been simplifying, diluting some of the material which I have and leaving the complex issues for different journal articles. So what I will be presenting, as I mentioned, is some of the aspects of my thesis and the work which I'm interested in. My primary focus in this lecture would be about the sources. I am interested in examining the sources, the Fatimid sources in North Africa. The questions which I would be asking is about the historicity. Like anyone would wonder how Fatimids were able to gather these many numbers of work in North Africa, in Qayrawan, in Mansuria, later on in Cairo. So, and if they were able to collect and gather these sources, what is the historicity of these works? This question is important simply because North Africa is considered to be on the periphery. It's not considered to be in the mainland, so-called mainlands of like Baghdad or like Qum, Medina, Kufa. So these were the Shi'i centers. North Africa was not among them. So if we are gathering some of the sources, we are engaging in some of the sources mentioned in early Fatimid period, the critical question to be asked is, what about the historicity of these sources? So that is something which would be a focus of my talk tonight. The second aspect, which is related to the reception, is the question, which is related to sources, is the question of a reception. So if these sources ended up being in North Africa, how the sources were received and conceived by the Fatimids. So this is an aspect which I will be shedding some light on it. And lastly, my talk will also address the issue of selection and interpretation. So gradually building on, let's say, like, sources, we were able to identify some key sources in North Africa. They were received by the Fatimids, and Fatimid libraries were able to contain them. But the issue is when these sources started being transferred to Fatimid works. For instance, books of hadith, books of like exegesis, or books of seerah, or books of law, how these sources were selected and how they were interpreted. Were Fatimids influenced by a local intellectual milieu of North Africa, where Sunnis were there, the next door neighbors? What sort of influence or give and take is taking place? This is something which I am equally interested in this talk. So this is a brief sort of synopsis of what I would like to discuss tonight. We all know the Fatimid period is between 909 to 1171, and then the questions which I'm asking are important because, as we would see, like Professor Madelung in his article, which he published in 1970s on the sources of Ismaili law, he mentioned Ismaili law is essentially a compromise between Dweller and Zaidi law. So somehow Ismaili law is not understood to be prominent enough, and it is reduced to be somehow a compromise between two major sort of law system. I would like to challenge some of the aspect of what Madelung has concluded in this article. For instance, this is important because Poonawala, in his works, he mentions we can speak of an independent Ismaili law system, right? So this is a sort of, in my view, a better appropriation, a better articulation of what the Fatimid sources would look like, and how the law system, or like, not only law, books of hadith, seerah, tarikh, and so on and so forth, could be conceived. I would be still, indulge with me, I would be still in my my introduction for a while, and then I would start the three aspects which I just introduced about this historicity of the sources, reception of the sources, and selection and interpretation of the sources are concerned. But as far as my sources are concerned, what I'm reading and what I'm building my research on are as follows. So I would be primarily interested in the primary sources of the Fatimid period, such as Iftatah al-Da'wa of Qadi Nu'man, al-Majalis al-Musarat. Unfortunately, often neglected as a as a source, whereas al-Majalis is extremely valuable in terms of how intimately Al-Qadi an-Nu'man was with the Imams, and in his encounters and engagement with the first four Imams, he is providing us with a wealth of information. And I haven't seen any independent study on al-Majalis, which should be conducted, which a research should be conducted on. Kitab al-Munazarat of Ibn al-Haytham is another interesting and a valuable source for us to consider when we study and when we analyze the events and the sources of this period. I will be discussing Ibn al-Haytham and his book in a while. Sirat al-Sajozar and many other sources, which we would like to call it primary sources, are important for my research work. As far as Al-Qadi an-Nu'man is concerned, he is the only collector and interpreter of the Fatimid legacy in the period which we are discussing, early Fatimid period in North Africa. So for that reason, you won't be surprised if I would exclusively focus on Al-Qadi an-Nu'man and his work. So Al-Ida is a very rich source in terms of gaining an understanding of the sources of Fatimids and Fatimid libraries. Kitab al-Akhbar, again of Qadi Nu'man, Mukhtasar Asar, al-Muntakhaba, al-Ikhtisar, Da'am al-Islam, not to forget, Ta'wil al-Da'am, and we could count many other sources as far as our research is concerned. When it comes to secondary literature, I'm building my research on the previous works of like Ismail Punala, who has written extensively on both Qadi Nu'man and Ismaili studies in general. Madlang, I already introduced him. Paul Walker's study is exceptionally important for my work, primarily for his 3 different articles on North African Fatimid libraries. So certainly I'm benefiting from his work, although my angle is completely different. I'm not precisely looking from the viewpoint which Paul Walker has looked. I'm more interested in the content and building my research about the sources from the content by comparing what I call cross-regional textual analysis, which we'll be discussing tonight. Kolbeck's work are important for my research, particularly his work on Ibn Tawus' library and the way he's constructing. Robert Glee's work on hadith and fiqh are equally pertinent for my research because the resources which I'm using from Qadi Nu'man are heavily based on hadith and law. So, before I begin about addressing the 3 questions which I introduced earlier, let's just look at like intellectual milieu of North Africa, or when we discuss about like Fatimid libraries, in which milieu we are discussing the Fatimid libraries. I am assuming that we all read Arabic, but please just let me know if you need a bit more explanation and translation, but I would be just paraphrasing some of the material which I'm presenting here. So in order to understand and gain an appreciation of intellectual milieu where Fatimids existed, the one source which comes to my mind is reading Ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham is writing his memoir in 334 after Hijrah, corresponding to 946 of Common Era. Although he witnessed before the advent of the Fatimids and the early period of Fatimids, but he's writing his memoir much later. So what he's mentioning in this passage, which I will quote in a while, that is precisely the earliest period of the Fatimid Da'wah in North Africa. So the highlighted portion, he mentions وَلَقَدْ كَانَتْ كُتُبُ مَالِكْ وَأَبِي حَنِيفَةَ طُبَاءُ مِنَ الْأَطِبَّةِ. So he's explaining the hegemony of the Fatimid and how the Fatimid resources were overwhelming to the extent that books of Malik and books of Abu Hanifa, they were marginalized to the extent that they were sold not sold, they would be found in some surgeries, or like, with some doctors, or sayadila, in a pharmacist, attarin, grocery. Yarbituna fiha, they used to wrap their prescription in those papers, which were books of Malik and Abu Hanifa. Istighfafan biha wa istihqaran laha. So I don't want to mention, like, how books of Abu Hanifa and Malik were degraded. What I'm interested is the books of Malik and Abu Hanifa were prominent before the Fatimids arrived, and how Fatimids gained, and how their works took, based on the record of Ibn al-Haytham, how Fatimids gained the hegemony. So the thing is, Fatimid sources are appearing in this milieu, where books of Malik and books of Abu Hanifa were equally important in the earliest period. When it comes to Qadi Noman's earlier bringing, we have in An-Nujum al-Dhahira of Ibn Taghribirdi, where he mentions Wakana, I'm just reading the underlined words, Wakana Hanafi al-Madhab. So the madhab of Hanafites were prominent in the region which we are discussing. Kana yawma dhalik ghalibuhu Hanafiya. An overwhelming majority of the people followed Hanafi madhab. Ila nahawal an-nas ala madhab Malik faqat, right? So the mazhab of Malik is introduced as well. So Fatimid sources which we are discussing is in the milieu where you find Hanafites and Malikis in North Africa. If we were to look at Ibn Adari's al-Bayan al-Mughrib, again you see the Fatimids mentioning how, well, not Fatimids mentioning, Ibn Adari mentioning about the Fatimids, that how they were able to add something in adhan, wa amara bi ayyuzad fil adhan ba'da hayya ala salah hayya ala khair al-amal, which is a Shi'i identity marker, right? So this is a milieu in which the existing Sunni material is there, but then it is supplemented or surpassed by some Shi'i material. So that's the milieu in which we would like to study and analyze the sources. Again, here you see about Hayya ala khairil amal, or like, sounding or pronouncing Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the surah in a loud voice, in a jahri way, which was a Shi'i identity. I won't be reading the full. Lastly, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he mentions something about ala madhab al-Ismaʿiliya. So he is introducing something about, and let me read, I've translated this from Rafullah. Muhammad bin Nu'man was instructed to issue legal verdict based on the school of Isma'ilis and not the school of Shafi'ites, right? So I want to analyze all these issues in the light of the existing materials of Shafi'ites and Hanafites and Malikis, which existed in North Africa. So now I'm entering into the main topic. So as far as Al-Qadi Noman is concerned, because he is the only individual who is giving us a full picture of the Fatimid libraries, it would be pertinent to discuss briefly his biography. Qadi Noman was born in 903. Approximately, we don't have his exact birth date, birth year. I mean, in 925, he joined the Fatimid Da'wah. The third aspect, which is 934 to 953, almost 20 years, his role as a librarian in the Fatimid libraries is the critical moment. For me, Qadi Noman, his intellectual development is the result of this period where he's working as a librarian. Rest of the time, whatever he has done is a reproduction of the works which were done between 934 to 953. And it makes complete sense to me, at least, that his role as a librarian, equipped him with all the resources which he was needed. So, for instance, Qadi Nu'man's Da'am al-Islam is most celebrated source. But if we were to look, Da'am al-Islam is nothing but a reproduction of his earliest work, which is Al-Ida. Presumably, he wrote Al-Ida in this period. The Ayam was written much later, but you don't find anything new in the Ayam, which is not mentioned in Al-Ida. So, Al-Ida is his primary work in which he mentions scores of works and scores of sources, which will be discussing. And later on, when he came into administrative position, of course, as we all appreciate, like, our best time of research is when we are PhD students or when we are postdoc research fellows. But once we enter into lectureship and professorship and so on and so forth, we would be more looking to a sabbatical in order to stick to our research. Otherwise, lots of administrative duties would always be an obstacle for our researchers. And simply, I would guess the same is happening for Qadi Nu'man as well, because later period, you don't see anything new material. As I said, it's reconstruction and repackaging of the older material. So in 946, he was appointed as a judge in Tripoli, and now he comes into administrative position. 948, he becomes like he assumes highest judicial office. In 954, he becomes the chief judge under the caliphate of Imam al-Mu'id. In 970, he goes to Egypt in Cairo, and in 974, he passes away. So that's a brief biography as far as Al-Qadi Nu'man is concerned. His mandate was to define the contours of the new madhab, right? Because the Fatimids have come into power. Of course, they need fiqh, they need law, they need Quranic exegesis, they need works to mention who they are and what they believe in and what they think of, like, Islamic sources and its material. Who is going to take this mandate? And none other than Al-Qadi Nu'man. In this process of defining the contours of the new madhab, he composed lots of reputations against Maliki, Shafis, and Maliki, Shafis, and Ahnaf. In this process, he had to devise different techniques of like derivation of law. And what was the outcome? The outcome was like he was able to lay the foundation of the Ismaili madhab, and he developed a new legal theory. Before I jump to the sources, I would like to highlight one point, like why Al-Qadi Nu'man, why mandate was given to Al-Qadi Nu'man. And here comes Ibn al-Haytham's role. So before Al-Qadi Nu'man, there were scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, like Mirwadi, right? like Dai of Malusa. So all this, or Ubaidullah Ashi, Abdullah Ashi, and his brother Abul Abbas, and other scholars as well. But because the Dawah was in turmoil in the previous period, as if the Fatimids arrived at this conclusion that a fresh material, a fresh face has to be introduced. And here comes Al-Qadi Nu'man, right? So Al-Qadi Nu'man has not witnessed the events which the previous scholars have witnessed. So he was never engaged in the rift which the previous scholars or like Du'at were involved in. And for that reason, somehow they were alienated. So you don't see their work being prominent. The head figure or the only figure, the only spokesperson about the Ismaili material is Al-Qadi Nu'man in this period. And I happen to believe that was the strategy of the Fatimids in this period, to get a monolithic and a consistent output from their officers. So, as far as the sources are concerned, Al-Qadi Nu'man, as I mentioned, provides us with the host of sources, right? So these are like, his sources of Al-Ida, which Professor Madlang has mentioned, but I have built on extracting like, number of hadith and how each of the sources correspond with early materials. So for instance, Kitab al-Qadaya, Kitab al-Salat, Kitab Hamad bin Isa, Jam al-Halabi, Kitab al-Halabi, Al-Kutub al-Ja'fari, and so on. So I won't take your time mentioning all these sources. But the fact Al-Qadi Nu'man is mentioning all these sources in his works gives us the impression how resourceful the libraries were and how resourceful Al-Qadi al-Nu'man was in terms of articulating the Fatimid literature and documenting the Fatimid literature. The one source which, as an example, which I would be highlighting is Kutub Muhammad bin Salam, which is already highlighted in pink over here. For instance, in the surviving Alida, we don't have Alida in its entirety, but the surviving Alida, we get 157 reports from this work, from this source of Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, Kutub Muhammad bin Salam. In my thesis, and I've developed a theory which I call cross-regional textual analysis, in order to establish the historicity of these sources. Because the question is, as I said, and very unfortunately, I should say, sometimes these sources are considered to be in periphery, simply for the fact because that was in North Africa, it wasn't in Medina, it wasn't in Baghdad. So had Al-Qadi al-Nu'man composed his work in Medina or in Baghdad, he would have gained reputation. But because he's writing in Qayrawan, apparently that is inferior, that is like, less credible. It doesn't carry that much weight. This is the thing which we find in secondary literature, which I am suggesting that we should be looking not from that angle, but from enhancing his historicity by comparing with other sources. Because when you compare Qadi Nu'man's citations with other sources, you find similar results, which gives us the impression that these sources were credible and they were not inferior by any means. So in order to establish the historicity of these works, which we find in the Fatimid libraries in North Africa, we may want to analyze what I call cross-regional textual analysis. So this method considers three aspects, three considerations, and these three considerations are important in order to gain confidence in terms of historicity of the early sources. So first of all, what we have to do in this method is to analyze the works of Al-Qadi al-Nu'man and compare it with other works which are composed in other regions. So Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, and like other scholars, they both cite one thing, given the fact they live in different regions, right, gives us the impression that they are citing from a common source. And this source could be dated back much earlier, as we would see in subsequent slides. So the first consideration is the two scholars whom we are analyzing, they should be existing, they should be living in two different regions. Number two, they should be contemporaries, right? In order to gain our confidence that they are not copying from each other, they are not using each other's sources for their work, right? So they have to be contemporaries to the extent that they haven't met with each other, right? Rather, they are using some sources which are dating earlier. And the third consideration, which we may want to take seriously as well, is the different religious persuasions, right? So Qadi Nu'man being Ismaili, Al-Kulini being a Dweller Shiites. So if they use the same material, right, it would give us more confidence in terms of, like, coming from two different religious persuasions, but citing a similar material, which would build more and more, which would enhance the credibility and the historicity. In this case, Kutub ibn Salam, I'm analyzing Ismaili versus Zaidi, right? So this is cross-regional textual analysis. Here you see the Imam being the Shiite Imam living in Medina, for instance. Then we have narrators from both. Narrator A, who is presumably the companion of the Imam, he's in Medina, and narrator B, presumably the companion of Imam in Medina. And this both Medinan companions, they are transmitting their material to different places. One in Egypt, other in Kufa. From Egypt, it goes to Qayrawan. From Kufa, it goes to Qum. So this is the way I'm building cross-regional textual analysis, this method, and based on which the historicity of the sources which Qadi Noman is laying for us in his works would be enhanced much more. As an example, as I said, we are discussing the books of Muhammad bin Salam, although it's in a plural form, kutub. This is what, like, we find in the existing Alida. Qadi Noman doesn't say kitab, he says kutub, right? Apparently, like it might have been chapter. We could discuss what are the reasons for mentioning kutub, not kitab. But this is what we see in Alida and like Qadi Noman's other sources. So, and as you see in the title, I presented like Zaidi material in Al-Qayrawan, right? Because Qutb Muhammad bin Salam is a Zaidi source. How come Zaidi material is in Qayrawan or in North Africa in general? That's a question. Well, due to several reasons. As I said, like although Qadi Noman is a spokesperson, but like Qadi Noman was very young, right? When the previous scholars were busy in promulgating the Fatimid da'wah. So scholars like Muhammad al-Kufi, scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, right? So these scholars had Zaidi affiliation. For instance, Ibn al-Haytham, who writes his memoir, which is published in the form of Kitab al-Munazara, Ibn al-Haytham, he mentioned his memoir, like his uncle had Zaidi tendencies, right? Presumably, not only just having Zaidi tendencies, he was a Zaidi. So Zaidi presence was visible. I won't say to a greater extent in Qayrawan, but to the extent Ibn Haytham is mentioning about his uncle and like, himself in his early days, he was a Zaidi. So this gives us the impression like Qadi Noman had exposure to Zaidi material, and one shouldn't be surprised if Qadi Noman later on starts documenting or starts citing Zaidi sources. So as far as this book is concerned, Qutb Muhammad bin Salam, the way it would work, how it ended up in Qadi Noman's library in North Africa, in general, like Fatimid libraries. Let's look at this chart. Here you see Ahmad bin Isa bin Zayd and other Zaydi Imams. They existed, they lived in Kufa because Kufa was the headquarters for the Shiites. In Ahmad bin Isa bin Zayd, who is the prime narrator of the reports which I mentioned in Qutb Muhammad bin Salam, you have two different narrators mentioning this or recording this. On your left-hand side, you see several Zaidi scholars reporting from Ahmad bin Isa. Prominently, someone named Muhammad bin Mansur al-Muradi, who is in Kufa. On your right-hand side, you see Muhammad bin Mansur al-Muradi transmitting to Yemen. So the reports of Muhammad bin Mansur al-Muradi are migrating and being transferred to Yemen. On the left-hand side, from Kufa, it goes to Egypt, presumably, because we don't know the whereabouts precisely about Muhammad bin Salam. But I would like to believe Muhammad bin Salam comes from Egypt, and Muhammad bin Salam's works are later on transferred to Al-Ida in Al-Qayrawan in North Africa. So these are like the way we may want to think how one source born in Kufa, through one chain, it might go to Yemen, through other chain, it might go to Qayrawan. So my interest in analyzing these cross-regional textual analysis, I would share the figures in a while, in a moment. But my interest is like Qadi Noman sources are credible. We could reach back to the authenticity and the credibility by cross-textual analysis. I won't bore you with like, these diagrams and these charts, but it shows the complex nature of how the Isnad is working as far as the Zaidi material and Al-Qadi Noman is working. but this might be easier and convenient for us to get an impression. So again, on your left-hand side, you see Amali of al-Muradi, a Zaydi source, a collection of roughly 266 hadith. On your right-hand side, you would see Kitab al-Salam as reported in Al-Ida, altogether, like, more than 150 hadith. 84 of them are common, right? Kutub ibn Salam and Amali of al-Muradi. So the Yemeni source and the source of Qayrawan, 84 reports are common, which gives us an impression like both Muradi and Ibn Salam are citing from previous sources. And thus what Qadi Nu'man is narrating, despite the fact he is living in periphery, is not living in the mainland, is a credible source in order for us to investigate and delve deeper and taking it seriously into consideration as far as our researchers are concerned. Now, what are the leftover materials which you don't find common? We could always discuss in question and answers. Again, this gives a breakdown of all the Zaydi scholars who are mentioned in Qadi Nu'man's work. And here you see again how Qadi Nu'man's chain is different, but eventually they lead to Abu Khalid, to Zayd bin Ali. This was I'm cognizant of I have less than 7-8 minutes left for my from my time. I would jump to the second. I would like to just remind you that we started from, I was interested in 3 things. Number one, about the sources and, historicity of the sources. The second interest was the reception of the sources. And the third was the treatment of Qadi Nu'man as far as the sources are concerned. So let's focus on the second issue, the reception of the sources. So when it comes to the reception, Qadi Nu'man is selective in terms of which source he has to consult and which source takes precedence over the other source. For instance, when it comes to Zaydi sources, at one place Qadi Nu'man says, well, this is mentioned by Qasim al-Rassi, who is a Zaydi Imam, a Zaydi scholar, and then he mentions another report. He says, I won't go with Qasim al-Rassi. Well, he doesn't mention because he's Zaydi, but the way he's articulating, it's quite clear that he is giving an inferior treatment to a Zaydi source compared to other sources coming from Ja'far bin Muhammad, the 6th Imam of Shi'ites, 12 Shi'ites. And then, of course, Ismail Imam as well, but different numbering. When it comes to the names of the Zaydi scholars, there is an element of censorship, whom he would like to mention and where he would like to omit. So, for instance, here you see Al-Ida and the Islam. The Aim being Qadi Nu'man's last work, Al-Ida being the first work. Al-Ja'fariyat is a Shi'i source. Shi'i, well, I don't want to say 12 Shi'i sources because in those early period, it's not quite clear the distinction of Zaydi, Ismailis, and Shi'ites. But let's, for the sake of understanding, let's say Ja'fariyat, which later came to be a source celebrated by the dwellers. In Al-Ida, you have 78 reports. In the Aim, you have 34 reports. So Qadi Nu'man quotes almost half of those reports. Whereas when it comes to Kutub ibn Salam, a Zaydi source, and in early period, you have 126, but in his peak, in the peak of his career, Qadi Nu'man, he just mentions 25 reports, right? It's quite clear that based on the statistics and this number, that later on, he didn't give that much attention to Zaydi sources in early period years. And for that reason, I was contesting Professor Madlung's conclusions that it's a compromise. Well, it's not a compromise. Clearly, Qadi Nu'man is aware what he's doing, and he gives this different. He's receiving the sources and giving treatment in different ways. When it comes to tools of interpretation and his articulation of different things, as far as his law is concerned, he's quite clear in his al-Ida. For instance, I'm quoting Sunnis followed women exercise personal judgment by applying qiyas, istihsan, nadar, ra, istidlal, ijma in the legal interpretation, which we as Isma'ilis shouldn't be taking. That's what he is concluding. These tools yield nothing but conjecture. That's from Ikhtilaf Usul al-Madhahib, and he quotes from Imam al-Mu'id as well. So I won't be taking your time as far as these citations are concerned. My last segment, my third focus as far as sources is concerned, is about selection, interpretation, and what I would like to call appropriatization of these sources as well. And here you see Qadi Nu'man being influenced by the milieu in which he is writing, influenced by the sources which he is consulting. And when I say influence, I by no means I want to say positively, negatively, or like being influenced is a bad thing or a good thing. I keep this judgment. I keep this to the best of your judgment. I'm just narrating and stating what I think without making any judgment whatsoever. So as far as appropriatization is concerned, you would see the word amal quite prominent in his works, right? So for those who are familiar with Shi'i sources and Shi'i legal material, amal is not something which Shiites would take recourse to or adhere to, right? This is precisely a Maliki concept, amal of Ahlul Medina. And we know Malikis were like, prominent in North Africa. So when Qadi Nu'man quite frequently using this word amal, it gives us the impression that he is using the same lingo which is existing in the region where he is operating. Now, he mentions about ijma as well, but his ijma is not something what 12 Shiites would claim in Baghdad, for instance, right? He comes up with the concept of ijma rawat an ahl al-bayt. Here, you would see Zaydi tendencies. Now you may call it tendencies or like Zaydi way of expressing. So ijma of Ahlul Bayt, that's his Zaydi concept, right? And here you see Qadi Nu'man using it with slightly tweaking it, ijma rawat an Ahlul Bayt. Let me quote a couple of examples what I just said about amal and ijma to gain the impression that how Qadi Nu'man is using these things. I won't be reading full the highlighted portion. وَالَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْعَمَلِ عليه العمل, right? فالعمل على تركه عليه العمل والعمل على غير هذا وعليه العمل والذي عليه العمل عليه العمل, so on and so forth. So as far as ijma of Ruwat is concerned, here you see on page 28 of Al-Ida, أجمع رواة أهل البيت, أجمع الرواة, اتفق رواة أهل البيت. So and these are like some of the ways in which I'm building my case in terms of, it's not about just the sources in North Africa, but we have to pay attention to how the sources were perceived, how they were received, how they were treated, and how they were appropriatized, right? So when Qadi Nu'man is mentioning amal, this is not a Maliki amal, right? His amal is different. He's operating in a different way, although the word is used, what is used in Maliki context, right? And in Maliki works. He's using ijma or rawat, but in a different sense than what Zaydis would use. So that's why I won't discuss this. If we get time, we could, I'm just summarizing now. My interest for this presentation and the work which I'm like, currently busy doing it. Now, what does this libraries and Qadi Nu'man's engagement tell us about early sources, particularly about hadith and law? What about the historicity of the sources? It's a mixing, it's a missing puzzle in the existing literature, and perhaps Qadi Noman's work and the Fatimid works and Fatimid libraries in North Africa would give us much more information about credibility and historicity of the early Shiite sources. Summary, pre-Fatimid Maliki Hanafi legacy, we discussed about before the advent of Fatimids, these were there. As far as Hanafi acquaintance is concerned, Ibn Taghribi has this idea of Fatimids were inclined in an early stage, which I doubt, but that's an early source mentioning something to us to reflect and ponder. Qadi Noman's mandate was to provide a consistent monolithic legacy of Fatimids as far as different disciplines of Islamic literature is concerned. And Qadi Noman was able to collect different sources because of his role as a librarian. And based on my research, that's the period in which he's writing most of his stuff and his consulting sources. A critical approach in receiving and reading the sources whenever we read these sources. And the popularization of certain tools like Amal, Ijma, al-Bayt, and other techniques, which I didn't get time to expand in this talk. Thank you for listening, and I would welcome your feedback, comments, instructions, and further sources as well as questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kumail, for this excellent presentation, which really shows the amount of work you're doing and really your very careful assessment of this very complex topic. I'm not a specialist of this topic, but that's the kind of impression I am getting. Now, we do have time for questions now. And just as a reminder, if anyone has a question, please use the Q&A box, which normally you will find at the bottom of your screen. If you can type your question in there, and then I will read it out to Kumail. I really enjoyed the parallel you pointed out between the productivity of someone who's a librarian with someone who today is a PhD or a postdoctoral researcher, and how actually the productivity drops once you get a permanent position. It was really quite a good one. I mean, so essentially what you imply is that when one was employed as a librarian, that person would have sufficient time also for research. I was just wondering if you knew anything more specific about the work of a librarian at that stage, what kind of tasks that would involve, and how was it possible to reconcile that with time dedicated to the research?
Excellent question, Nikolai. It comes to my mind a various aspect of Qadi Noman's work as a librarian. So in his encounter later on in Al-Majalis wal-Musayyarat, which I said, like, it's very much resourceful and excellent source for early life of Al-Qadi Noman and his interaction with the Imams. So in his interaction with the Imams, he would mention about like what he used to do in the early period when he was a librarian. So his role as a librarian was to record the material which he is inheriting from the Imams, because that's a missing thing. Paul Walker mentioned in work camels were loaded with certain works and books which came to North Africa. These was resources which Qadi Noman just got hand of it. He had to document it. He had to make an inventory, a catalog, so to speak, in today's language, of all the material which he had. So apart from making these catalogs, he will have to do a scholarly work as well. So in today's world, I'm not that familiar, but a librarian won't be expected to conduct a thorough research as far as content is concerned. Right, because that would be left to other experts, because a library would have expertise in certain things which a researchers won't have. A researcher would have expertise in certain things which a library won't have. So today it's divided, but at that time, Qadi Nu'man, after having this catalog, he was instructed to make use of the content. So for example, he would cite Jami' al-Halabi, and Jami' al-Halabi is a primarily, let's not take the work of Jami' al-Halabi because it contains like many other things. Kitab al-Salat is the best example of Haris bin Abdullah Sijistani. So Qadi Nu'man's work is to make this collection divided into the different chapters of his work, right? So Kitab al-Salat of Haris contains, let's say, like, 100 reports. Qadi Nu'man would have to read it and divide this, which of these reports would go into which section of his book, which chapter. So he would have to chapterize the material as well. So it's a scholarly work which has been done over here. Number 3, which comes to my mind, again from Al-Majalis wal-Musarat, in which he mentions, is that he had to make copies and give instructions of making further copies of certain key resources. So for example, like the certain works on Tariq, right? Tabari's work, for instance, those were which he thought to be of prime importance were to be copied as well. And being resourceful, he had all the means to hire people to copy these works as well. But unfortunately, to the best of the research, we don't see the names and the contributors apart from Al-Qadi Nu'man. Apparently, that was the policy that, there should be one voice, there should be one person being a spokesperson about the entire literature. But certainly he had a team which is quite visible. We don't know the names, but which is quite understanding based on his conversation, which are recorded in Al-Majalis wal-Musaira.
I see. That's fascinating. I see that we do have a question here from John Mason, who's asking, how were these different sources, schools of Fatimid Shia reflected in various religious practices in communities across North Africa? How did they influence the history of Islam in North Africa?
Excellent question, John. Something which is a question for me as well. So I won't have an answer, but I would share preliminary thoughts concerning this question, which has occupied my mind since the last few years. It's a very key thing to look at it, but the impression which I'm gaining is that Fatimids specifically, or Ismailism in general, were never able to leave their footprints as far as their thoughts or religious practices are concerned. Simply because, number one, there were minorities, I would say minorities within the minorities, Ismailis within like larger Shi'i populace. Although we have to be very careful in terms of, like, as I said, like, considering Ismailis as a minority vis-a-vis like 12 Shiites, because this is North African milieu, it's not Baghdad or Medina. So I'm aware of that, but I'm speaking broadly and very generally. Ismailis were not able to leave behind the impact on the religious practices. So in Al-Bayan al-Mughrib, yes, in early stage, Hayya ala Khair al-Amal was introduced. Bismillah, this is a Shi'i identity marker. The pronouncing of Bismillah in a louder voice, which is called Jahri, in daily prayers, that was normalized. But normalized to what extent? Normalized in those places where Shiites used to gather to pray, right? Where Ismailis used to gather to pray. not in a mosque where Ahnaf used to gather, not in the mosque where, like, Malik is used to gather, for instance, right? So I gather what John is asking is about the larger impact. So larger impact, what an attempt was made in the earlier period, what Ibn Adari mentions, right? But it is not sweeping or, like, across the board. Having said that, there are important events which were, of course, we could call it religious practices, and it left some kind of impression. For instance, the day of Ghadir being celebrated, right? Because celebration is something which would require shops to be shut down, because they would go in the markets and bazaars. So that had a wider appeal. And that is something, yes, it impacted other communities or other Muslim communities as well. Or the day of Ashura, right? The 10th of Muharram. So these are like certain things which we could consider that these religious practices impacted or reflected in the larger Muslim populace of the region. The third thing, my first thing, as I said, they couldn't, like, we can't generalize it. Second, I said, like, yes, this Ghadir or Muharram we could consider. Third thing which I came to my mind is about, Mirwazi. So Mirwazi was, like, somehow radical. That's the impression which we get from Kitab al-Munazarat. So he wanted somehow to be radical in terms of expanding Ismaili legal thoughts across the regions, to the extent, like, people were persecuted. But that's, like, just at the end of the 3rd century, right? 297, 298, 299, after Hijrah. So in this period, he was, but then apparently Imam wasn't happy, right? Ubaidullah al-Mahdi strategy was different. His strategy was to, be calm and be composed in the face of these radical changes. And that this tells us, like, somehow a difference of understanding, because the early du'at, likes of Ashi, his brother, Mirwazi, Ibn al-Haytham, these people were thinking when Imam would come, well, everyone would become Ismailis, and, like, we would have a sort of a generalized Ismaili culture over here. But that never happened, right? And Imam was visionary in terms of this is not going to happen. So all these early scholars were sidelined, who were kind of, like, radical in their thoughts. I don't know, I shouldn't be saying radical, but anyway, you know what I mean, right? And then Al-Qadi and Umar would come, who is intellectually capable of articulating. So these are, like, 3 thoughts, 3 different points as far as my early thoughts about this question are concerned.
Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the slide where you discuss the transmission of all of this. So from Medina to Egypt and then to Kairouan. I was just wondering if we know anything about how this physically happened, this physical transmission. How did these things move around, actually?
Wow, this is incredible. This is really incredible, because let's unpack this in this way. So the convention of things being transmitted, based on my understanding, was primarily through oral transmission.
Right.
When I say conventional approach, this is, like, in Sunni material. As far as Shi'i works are concerned, due to obvious reasons, these were not transmitted through oral transmission. Rather, they were transmitted through written sources. So this is the first distinction we will have to keep in mind in order to analyze this question. The reason this is important is because of the different intra-madhab equations are concerned. So Sunnis, again, I'm using this word Sunnis as Sunnism is a later construct, right? But what we may think about the early generation as Sunnis, they were large in numbers. They had all the luxuries of having transmitting through the oral transmission. For instance, a companion, a successor would transmit reports. There would be literally hundreds of other pupils who would be listening to these reports, and these hundreds would go to different regions. Some of them would be, transmitting the material. So there are oral transmissions going on because there is a strong network. Shiites, or what we may want to call them, like, early or proto-Shiites, they didn't have this luxury, being less in number, being few in number, coupled with like taqiyya and sanctions and being under house arrest, so on and so forth. So they had limited exposure. So eventually, they didn't have the luxury of conducting this, mass sort of transmission. So oral transmission didn't work for them. We have written transmission, or let's call it like, books were transmitted. The evidence for this, what we have is in Shiite context, you have books of Faharis. So Najashi has a book on Faharis. Tusi has a book on Faharis. So what are this genre of Faharis is concerned? So genre of Faharis would tell us like, this is the companion of Imam. He had this book. He composed this work. He composed Kitab Yawm wa Layla. He composed Kitab Haris, and how this Kitab looked like and how many chapters it had, so on and so forth. So this genre is missing in Sunni context. Why it is missing? Because there were no books in the first place in order to develop this genre. Well, when I say there were no books based on one scholarship, because likes of Fuad Siskeen or Nabi Abbot or Mustafa Adami, they would say, no, early companions had like, Sohof and like small books and handbooks, on and so forth. So because of two different style of transmission, it is reasonable for us to think these books were transmitted in a physical form from Medina to Egypt. So for the case in conversation being Kutub al-Ja'fariya. So Kutub al-Ja'fariya, the sons of Al-Qadim, Imam Al-Qadim, who is the seventh Imam, they go to Egypt with all these collections, physical collections, which later are transmitted. I don't have the link for this, but I would like to believe from Egypt, these collections ended up being in Fatimid libraries. Because when Qadi Noman is mentioning, he mentions in a physical form. He doesn't say that I have heard from my teachers or like from Imam, right? Because he had no teachers, so to speak, or sheikh in terms of like, being a link in the isnad. He says fil kutub al-Ja'fariya. Sometimes he uses singular for other books, right? Or sometimes he says wajadtu, or he says ra'aytu. So all these expressions which he's using indicates he had these books in physical forms, which he inherited from the previous generations, which I would like to believe is from Egypt. So from Medina to Egypt, we have references quite clear. From Egypt to Qayrawan, we don't have that quite clear evidence, but we have contextual evidence which would help us think it should be physical. We have again clear indications towards Qum. So from Medina to Kufa, from Kufa to Qum, there we have like, lots of inflow going on as far as physical works are concerned.
I see. Well, this is just amazing. So, well, thank you very much again, Kumail, for such an interesting, brilliant talk, really. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as well. I'd just like to make one final announcement about our lecture series, which will resume in the new year with a talk by Muna Haroon on the story of Cyrenaican horses in the Greek and Roman periods and its reality. Now, this talk is jointly organized with the University of Oxford as part of a seminar series, and it will take place in person at the University of Oxford at the Johannes Center on the 7th of February, 4 p.m. UK time. There will be full details circulated shortly to members, and then information will be available as usual on the BILNAS website and social media. So thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight, and thanks again, Kumail, for such a great talk.
Thank you, Nicolo, and thank you, Pauline, and everyone.